It certainly isn't going great for him, it has to be said. I think all hope is not quite yet lost. His gamble has always been that the fear of a far-right government will force all of the other parties to come back together and work together, which is something they have failed to do for the past 2 years. So it's not like he left a great place for this mess. He left one mess for another. There is some sign now that minds are starting to focus for the second round. Parties who are in a third place in a three-way race are starting to stand down to concentrate the vote against the far right. Whether that will be enough to keep the far right out of government is one question. Whether those parties would then be able to work together to form an alternative government is another question altogether.
Yeah, so could you see the left and Macron's grouping come together, or do you think that would be highly improbable?
The problem we have at the moment is that the left have formed a broad alliance running all the way from the far left party, LFI, right the way through to the moderate left, who are quite close to the centre. It's certainly plausible for Macron to work with the moderate left. The problem is that he cannot work with the far left. He hates them. They hate him. So the question is what we're going to do with the far left. Are they going to continue to be part of this left-wing bloc, in which case I think we've got a real stalemate? Or would it be possible for the rest of the left to possibly ditch the far left and work with Macron, in which case they might have enough seats between them and enough agreement between them to form an alternative government?
So they've got a week to make up their mind on that. In the meantime, 34% would suggest that the far right now has the biggest amount of support in France.
Yes, they came a clear first, not quite as high as the polls in the past week suggested they would get. They were polling at closer to 37%. They got 33. But that's still nearly double what they got only 2 years ago. And bear in mind that before a couple of years ago, they only had a small handful of seats in Parliament. So this has been a long time coming, and this really is their moment. They are now suddenly incredibly popular, and that has caused a great deal of consternation in France and across Europe, the possibility of having a far-right party in government.
Do you think the call from the right, from Marine Le Pen particularly, to give them the chance to govern in their own right would be heeded?
I don't think that her call to the French voters is going to be what decides the election. But their prospective prime minister has said that he doesn't want to form a minority government. He wants to lead a majority because he knows that a minority government is going to get blocked from all sides. So it's up to the French whether they want a far-right majority government or whether they want to block it. I think a lot of people voting for the far right are pretty disillusioned with the state of French politics, which has been in disarray for some time. So some of them agree with the far right, and I think another substantial proportion are just fed up with everybody else and don't know what else to try.
Indeed. Let's talk about the likely Prime Minister, just 28. What do we know about him? What experience does he have of government?
His experience of government, he has none. No one on the far right has experience of government. They've never been in government. He's clearly very young. That's part of his appeal. He's bringing in young voters to the party that the party hasn't previously been able to reach. And he's a good counterpart to the outgoing Prime Minister, Attal, who is also not as young, but in his 30s. So we've got this new generation of politicians coming in. He has led the party for a couple of years. He's extremely charismatic. Ideologically, he's very much on the same page as Marine Le Pen. And whilst he is currently the public face of the party and the person who would be prime minister, she is still very clearly the person at the helm hoping to become president in 3 years' time.
How would a government not of Macron's party, what would it mean for the rest of his presidency?
He would end up in a scenario known in France as cohabitation, where you have a president of one party and a government of the other. When both roles are held by the same party, the president rules supreme. When there's this division, the president becomes significantly weakened. The president would still have quite a lot of sway over international and foreign policy, but most domestic policy would then be led by the government. And so effectively, Macron would find himself being a lame duck president for the rest of his presidency.
Yeah.
But he would still have a platform from which to criticise the government and try to use his voice to draw attention to their every failing, as his predecessors in this scenario have done.
Yes. You know, you're talking about France's international reputation. It's also been looked to, you know, as a sort of leadership in the EU. What do you think the EU is thinking as they look at how this is playing out in France and what this means for France as a leading European nation?
The EU is very anxious. Only today, Donald Tusk was sort of speaking in horror about what this would mean. It's worth bearing in mind that Macron is a very pro-European president, but the far right are very anti-European, and one of their flagship policies, one of the ways they plan to fund a big chunk of their manifesto, is to withdraw a large amount of the funding that France puts into the EU. Their capacity to do that will be heavily constrained, bearing in mind that they've got to work with Macron. But it's their intention to move away from their involvement in Europe, their funding of Europe, their adhesion to the rules of Europe to the greatest extent possible. And in a scenario where we've already seen Brexit, I think having France take a step back from Europe as well would be very damaging for the European Union and its stability, yeah, especially when we've still got a war in Ukraine going on.
And that's such a good point. I mean, Macron came out and wanted to see French boots on the ground in Ukraine. Do you think there would still be support for Ukraine with this new government, with a potentially far-right government?
I think the support would be significantly weakened. The far right have been tainted in recent years by their associations with Russia, and they've tried to play that down because they know that that is a vote loser for them. So they've expressed support for Ukraine, but it's one thing to say a few polite words. I don't think they're willing to put their money where their mouth is. So they're not willing to translate that support into things like the supply of arms and weapons, and certainly not the supply of soldiers. So I think France would also be stepping back from Ukraine if the far right have anything to say about it.
Extraordinary times. Really great to talk, Rainbow. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.